Understanding Nationalism, Unit 10. After Napoleon, Europe's most powerful leaders wanted security and stability. To achieve those goals, they held the Congress of Vienna, a meeting of almost all the nations of Europe. The leader was Metternich of Austria, and the leading nations in attendance were Russia, Prussia, Great Britain, and France, in addition to Austria. The plan at the Congress of Vienna was to prevent future French aggression by surrounding France with strong countries. This would restore a balance of power in Europe where no country was much stronger or weaker than the others. One way to achieve this goal is to create countries of roughly equal size. They also wanted to restore the European monarchies, in other words, put the kings back in power. Why does the Congress of Vienna matter? The European nations were actually talking and cooperating with one another instead of arguing and fighting. The terms of the plan were fair to everyone involved, even France. The plan was a return to a more conservative or traditional style of government because these countries wanted to maintain political and social order after all the disruption that was caused by the Napoleonic Wars and his invasions of the surrounding countries. The nations promised to help each other in the event of internal rebellion so that the kings could stay in power. And this system maintained peace in Europe for almost 40 years until the Crimean War, and then again with no major war after that until World War I in 1914. Now, there are some competing ideas about power in Europe at this time. The leaders at the Vienna Conference were largely conservatives. They represented the ideas of wealthy property owners and the nobility who favored traditional ways of doing things, such as having kings with lots of power. But there were also people who would consider themselves liberals. They were the middle-class businessmen and merchants who favored giving power to a legislative group like a parliament or a Congress, and voting rights for the wealthy and educated. And then there were people who would be considered more radical or extreme. These are people outside the other two groups, conservatives and liberals, who favored drastic change and democracy for all. They wanted to practice the ideals of the French Revolution: liberty, equality, and brotherhood or fraternity. So even though the Congress of Vienna restores this sort of conservative approach to governing, the ideas of the liberals and radicals haven't gone away, and they're going to come up again and again through the 1800s in Europe as people try to work out the kind of government that they need to meet their needs. So what is nationalism? It's loyalty to your nation or your national group. A nation is a unified country with an independent government. The best examples of nations or nation-states in 1800s Europe are France, England, and Spain. What sorts of things inspire this nationalist loyalty or attitude? It's a group of people who have something in common, and that may be their culture, their religion, their ethnic origin, their history, language, or the territory and geographic region where they live. Any combination of those things can cause this feeling of pride and really this idea that your group is somewhat superior to the other groups around you. That's what nationalism is. What's the impact of nationalism? Well, it can be both positive and negative. People unite around common goals. Sometimes groups work for independence for their group or region if they're being dominated by a larger power or a part of an empire. And people work to create democratic governments under nationalism. However, on the other side, nationalism can present a situation where the opinions of the majority dominate and push out the ideas of the minority. This intense pride in your own group may lead you to persecute other groups and have situations where you actually get what's called ethnic cleansing, where one group tries to wipe out another group just on the basis of their ethnic origin or their race. And finally, competition among nations who have intensely nationalist feelings may lead to war. What impact did nationalism have in Europe in the 1800s? Nations fought to create independent states, and this is an example of those liberal radical thinkers fighting against more conservative leaders. The Greeks fought for independence against the Ottoman Empire. The Belgians rose up against the Dutch, the Italians against Austrian control, and the people of Poland fought Russia for their independence. In France, nationalism, the time of nationalism created another period of crisis where the government was very unstable and there was lots of social upheaval. But finally, after that crisis had passed, Napoleon III came to power, and he was a nephew of Napoleon Bonaparte. And under his rule, railroads were constructed, factories were built, unemployment decreased in France, and political and economic stability increased. In Russia, they saw the need to industrialize so that they could compete with European nations. They fought and lost a war in Crimea against France, Great Britain, Spain, and the Ottoman Empire due to a lack of transportation and industrial support. That showed the Russian leaders that they were going to have to do more to make their country competitive against these other nations in Europe. Russia abolished serfdom, but the peasants in Russia continued to struggle, and Russia continued to control a large empire. And within that empire, they practiced something called Russification, which means that they forced non-ethnically Russian areas under their control to follow Russian traditions and cultural practices in an attempt to hold their empire together. Some nations were able to unify their people under a single government during the 1800s. This is particularly true in Italy, where the unification movement was led by people like Cavour and Garibaldi at the expense of the Austrian Empire. And it was also true in Germany, where the Prussian Otto von Bismarck helped to lead unification at the expense of France and Russia. Empires began to break apart and lose power over their ethnically diverse and geographically diverse territories. This was true of the Austrians and the Ottomans. And by the late 1800s, Great Britain and Germany had increased their power. France had retained some of their power. They weren't really one of the strongest nations of Europe, but they also weren't one of the weaker nations in Europe. And the Austrians and the Russians were falling behind. This is the introduction to nationalism in the 1800s in Europe. If you need to rewind or rewatch any of this video, please feel free to do so. Thanks for listening.